copy of a letter, and I'm only going to read pieces of it, that the Smithsonian, the Chief Curator of Antiquities, sent to a donor. And I hope you'll enjoy this. Thank you for your latest submission to the institution. The layered, next to the clothesline post, hominid skull. We have given this specimen a careful, detailed examination and regret to inform you that we disagree with your theory that it represents conclusive proof of the presence of early man in Charleston County 2 million years ago. Rather, it appears that you have found is the head of a Barbie doll. Of the variety that one of our staff, who has small children, believes is a Malibu Barbie. It is evident that you have given great thought to this. However, the material is molded plastic. Ancient remains are typically fossilized bones. The cranial capacity is only 9 cubic centimeters, well below the threshold that we would expect. And the indentation pattern evident on the skull is more consistent with a domesticated dog than the ravenous man-eating clams that you speculated. Clams don't have teeth. And I'm going to go to the end because I love the end here. However, we gratefully, we gladly accept your generous donation of this fascinating specimen to the museum. While undoubtedly not a fossil, it is nonetheless yet a riveting example of the great body of work you seem to accumulate effortlessly. You should know that our director has reserved a special shelf in his office for the display of the specimens you have previously submitted. Isn't that wonderful? And without further ado, I do want to introduce our speaker of the evening. I can find my paper for that. We are delighted to have with us Curator Skip Brack, who's going to be discussing the early interactions between the English, French, and Maine Native Americans. But also, he has going to be talking a lot about tools, and he has some wonderful examples of them here, some very old tools. And that could be the concentration and part of the talk. Skip is the founder and curator of the Davistown Museum and proprietor of Jonesport Wood Company, which I know best for its ownership of wooden tools. Great place to go. Great place to go. While hunting for old tools in attics, workshops, cellars along the coast of Maine and New England, his curiosity got piqued and it raised more questions than he could answer. He has written several informative books about the history and use and making of hand tools in early New England, and we have some fantastic examples up here for you to take a look at, either if you didn't have a chance before or afterward. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Sir John.
I have to point out we're going to be doing a little bit of the video experimenting. So John's here to help, and the videographer, and what we're going to do is we're going to show you some slides with some essays about the historic marker we had put up in Hell's Cove. At the same time, I'm going to be telling you about tonight's subject, which is Wovosham and the Wowianock diaspora. So we're dealing with something that happened close by here. Anybody familiar with the Wowianock Indians? Have anybody heard that term? I'll get into that in a minute. But anyway, while I'm doing my introduction, John's going to run a little, and we'll have an essay from the first right side of the historic marker in Hell's Cove that you can read at the same time I'm gabbing. So can you do two things at once? I don't know. This is the experiment. But anyway. So anyway, I'm Skip, the tool buyer for Liberty Tool. And this is the 45th year in business poking around your cellars in coastal New England. So we get all kinds of tools that come through. My truck out front has about 6,000 pounds of tools. I'm just coming up from Boston today. And we do that every 2 weeks for 45 years. And the buying route goes from Bar Harbor to Fall River and back. And we like the coastal communities because that's where there's more woodworking tools from the shipbuilding industries. Getting very hard to find the big ones though. We do find all kinds of crowbars and screwdrivers and whatever. So you know how Liberty Tool is, it's sort of a big mess of tools. Anybody here have been to Liberty Tool?
Cheers,
Okay,
boy.
so Liberty, and how about upstairs to the Davistown Museum across the street? Okay, because that's, a lot of people go to Liberty Tool and they have no clue what's going on at this museum. So anyway, when I'm buying tools, the tools tell a lot of stories. And that's what I do, is to transfer the stories into the publications. So that's the sort of the sequence of essays that tell you about tools and how they're made, the history of technology, especially in New England, with respect to the. So anyway, that's the Davistown Museum building right there with the white one. The one next to it has been torn down. It's now a mobile gas station. So give it a click. And that's Liberty Tool. If anybody has not been there, that's the front entrance. And here's what the museum looks like inside. If you have not been to the Davistown Museum, instead of paying Uncle Sam a lot of taxes, what we've done is given a lot of the tools that were recovered to the museum. So the tools, about 3/4 of those tools are your tools, because we're a 501c3. A long, interesting story to that. But anyway. We also have 5 libraries. There's about 18 rooms, quite a lot of art, Maine Artist Guild. And so come visit if you haven't. And you can do photo tours of all the buildings and facilities online if you wish, in case you don't feel like driving to Liberty in the snowstorm or whatever. And the museum is open Thursday through Sunday, 11 to 5. Liberty Tool is open every day right now. Now, I'm going to be talking about Molossian and the Wollongong diaspora, and here we are at Thomaston, so a lot of what I'm talking about occurred in the Georges River or more to the west of Damascotta. You'll see some pictures of the Damascotta shell heaps. And especially, I'm going to mention a little bit later, the loop in the river up here, that is a very important archaeological site. It's one of the largest archaeological sites in eastern North America. There's quite a literature on it. It's a red paint site. Has anybody gathered any of the Indian artifacts from the Georges River at this location? Anyway, it should be made into a historic monument, in my opinion. And it's one of the most important historic sites in Maine. So we'll get to that in a little bit. So anyway, this textbook here that I have brought, and that's part of tonight's discussion, 2006 was the first edition, 2010 is the third edition. So why did I publish this? Well, does anybody know who Bruce Bork is? He's the state archaeologist. And he wrote a book called 12,000 Years Colon Native Americans in Maine. And in my younger days, I became a lifetime member of the Maine Historical Society back in the days when you could become a lifetime member for $300 or whatever it was. And I spent a lot of time up in the stacks reading all the town histories. So this is back in the 70s when I had a little bit more time. And especially 76, 78, we started Liberty Tool in 1976. And at that point I became quite interested in the local history. And all of your textbooks written about coastal Maine history mention the Wollongong Indians. Williamson, 1833, mentions the Wollongongs as one of the 4 key tribes of coastal Maine, along with the Kennebecks and the Androscoggins and another tribe to the south. And these are Abenaki tribes who flourished and constituted this confederacy of Molossian. So let's, now just a quick reference on number 1 up in the corner by Cape Cod. That is the key area in terms of iron making in the period between 1630 and 1720. A lot of these tools relate to that, and I'll get to that map. I'll get to that information a little bit later when we're talking about the tools. But remember that section, because before all the rock ore areas of New York and Pennsylvania were exploited, the bog iron country of Plymouth was the key area for tool making and smelting before 1720. After 1720, everybody switched to the rock ores became the main source of iron in the United States. But the bog iron was a critical source and makes an interesting chapter in our industrial history. So that's so anyway, in Norumbega Reconsidered, the reason why I wrote this book was I noticed that Bork, what I call the Borkian paradigm, he left out a whole chapter about Native Americans in Maine, including the Wowinoks. And he doesn't even mention the Wowinok community in his text. So they've been sort of written out of our post-1990 historical reviews of Maine's First Nation histories. So that was a concern, and so then I published this. My response to was comments on what he didn't have to say or was not being discussed in his book and in other books. And also I brought a copy, I forgot to bring his book, but over there's another copy of American Beginnings in the land of Norumbega. And that's another important history. And by the way, the book text is very, very well written, very important reference. It's just that he left out about 100 years, 80 years of history. American Beginnings is very interesting because in that text, they're talking about Norumbega, and they conclude that Norumbega was a figment of the imagination of European cartographers, and there was no such place. So I had a disagreement about that, and that's in this also. So we're talking about the land of Norumbega and Mowoshem and Norumbega overlap. So on your old maps, you'll see Norumbega on dozens of the maps that are in the back of this text. We have about 30 maps somewhere in here. Maybe it's the middle part. But anyway, so there's all kinds of maps of Maine, and every map is different. But about half the maps show Norumbega, and of course, one of the reasons why we put up the historic marker at the Breakneck Hollow historic site, and this just went up a couple of weeks ago. So what I'll have John do is just give everybody a minute to read that, and maybe move it up a little bit. And while I'm talking about that, you can read what's on the right side of the historic marker. On the left side of the historic marker, you have copies of that with you. On the left side of the historic marker, and we have erected, discusses Mowoshem and where it is and what happened to the Confederacy that was here until the great pandemic swept through in 1619. So let me see here. Now, in your handout there, you'll notice the first map is Mowoshem, if you look at that first page. And that's from, I think it's McBride, is it? That, an important book sponsored by the Abbey Museum in Bahama that tells you about Native Americans, especially after 1500. So that gives you an idea of the layout. So Mowoshem, as the Native American Confederacy, stretched from around York, Cape Nettic, up to Scooter Point, where I live. So we're 5 miles from Scooter Point, from where the historic marker is, across Frenchman's Bay. So why did they name my bay Frenchman's Bay? So we'll get into that in a minute. So anyway, the issue, when I wrote this in 2006, it's a continuing issue with me, and especially the need to document what has happened with Mowoshem. And since the tool barn up in Hulls Cove is located on the Edward Brewer property, he was a major shipwright on Mount Desert Island. Our house was built in 1817, and it was built on the site of a former Indian village. So Hulls Cove was a really important landing spot for Native Americans coming across from the mainland in the summer to dig shellfish. So we deal with the Cross Island Trail that goes down to southwest harbor and northeast harbor in terms of this historic marker. And I think the relevance for here is that this is sort of central Molosham in terms of the Georges River. So this is a key area for, and probably the most highly populated area here, plus Davistown. You'll notice later that the text that Davistown Shelby is a really important marker. Most of them are gone, but still we have a few photographs, which are really extraordinary photographs. Okay, let me see. So as we look at the history of Molosham, where did that information come from? How did we find out about Molosham? That's a very interesting story. When George Weymouth came here to coastal Maine 1605 to explore and to trade and do different things, he ended up kidnapping 5, well, some sources say 3, but I believe it would be 5 Native Americans from the area very close to here. There's several different versions of where the kidnapping took place, but I think it's noted on the handout there. And when he did the kidnapping, Native Americans had come to trade, and he captured a couple of them and hid them in the 3 to 5 of them in his ship. And then when some more came the next day, they didn't realize that some of the members of the community had been captured by the English. So he took them back to England, and he introduced them to Sir Fernando Gorges, who was the founder of Maine in terms of being the governor of Maine in 1822. He had that title. He never visited Maine. He lived in England, but he was really interested in North America. And what he did was he interviewed the Native Americans who were brought by George Weymouth to England. And that's where the story of Molosham emerged. And it was recounted to, let me see, the English writer Booklet. So the Gorges account of Molosham that the Native Americans had told him about was reprinted in a fairly obscure publication. Hucklet was a major English writer and produced hundreds of publications and texts and stories and essays, and one of them included the story of Molosham, and that was published, I think, in 1625. And that was kind of lost for a long time. It wasn't something that was in the history books, let's say, before 1980. In 1875, an obscure Maine historian named Barrage ran across that account of Molosham, and he wrote an essay about it that was also very obscure. He was not a well-known writer. But in 1980, Dean Snow, who wrote the Archaeology of New England, brought it all out in his textbooks in terms of what it was and who had told the English about Molosham and that sort of thing. So there's quite a long story about where all this originated, but it didn't really become known to Mainers in terms of if you're reading the history text until about 1980. So we have that whole story of Molosham emerging at that point, which is pretty late in terms of Maine history. Williamson, in his 1831 History of Maine, did not have any knowledge of the Confederacy of Molosham. But the Confederacy of Molosham was a series of tribes, the most important of which are the Wowynock community. And Frank Speck interviewed the last Wowynock, I think 1918, I have it in the handout here, and the Wowynock dialect. This was the last speaker who spoke the Wowynock dialect. So we know that there was still some Wowynocks left after the great pandemic. Okay. So we think about Molosham in terms of why did Molosham disappear? So Mewosha was a very thriving confederacy of tribal communities trading with each other. Rapid canoe travel played a big role. And in the handout someplace you'll see the picture of the shell heaps at Davistown. The shell heaps at Davistown are some of the largest in the world. The only ones of equal size, I believe, are in Borneo. So when you look at the shell heaps, think of the number of people that would be required to create shell heaps that big in the years of 1200 plus or minus 1400, 1900 back there. So you have a very vibrant community of First Nation Native Americans living in this area between Davistown and the loop of the river at Arambek. So at this point, we start looking at the history of Mewosha itself, and we see that in the 16th century, Cartier exploring the St. Lawrence River, and you begin to have French traders appearing, and sometimes they would be fishermen and also fur traders combined. Between 1500 and 1600, there were at least 100,000 voyages from Europe by fishermen and traders to the North American area, especially the Maritimes, before anybody thought of coming to Plymouth. So there was quite a lot of trading. Now, I don't think there was much trading down towards Mount Desert Island at that period, but a little bit later, Champlain landed in my yard 1604 to get water. And the watering place that's on the Breakneck Stream is a very evocative, very incredible little spot. And that was the main source of water for anybody visiting Frenchman's Bay for trading, or for the Native Americans before that. And the French traders, once they get going, probably after 1630, utilized the water in the Breakneck Stream many times. And there was quite a bit of trading in the Breakneck Hollow between the French and the Indians. Champlain was there just briefly in 1604. There wasn't much that happened until after Castine was made the capital of Arcadia in 1613. So then you begin to see the French traders coming in. And that whole period between 1613 and the beginning of the French and Indian Wars was a period of pretty intense trade between Native Americans and the French. And that's where our technology comes in, because what were the French trading? They wanted to get their beaver pelts for the large middle class in the Netherlands, France, and England, who loved beaver pelt hats, and they also had moose hides for various rugs and things. So the fur trade was very lucrative for the traders. And what they gave to the Native Americans were things like iron kettles, trade axes, which were very handy. What did I do with my trade axe? So here's a good example of what a trade axe might have looked like. And once the Native Americans had this kind of a tool, they could do things that they couldn't efficiently do with whatever stone tools that they had used up until, let's say, 1530. So after 1530, you have quite a radical change in the toolkits that would be available to Native Americans. So the trade axe is one thing. Iron kettles were a very popular trade item, but the most important trade item was the guns. So here's the explanation for the fall of Mewosha. 1607, you have the Battle of Saco. And why do we have the Battle of Saco between competing groups of Native Americans? The reason is the French got together with the Micmacs, and the Micmacs were the key fur traders. They were the aggressive traders who wanted to control the fur trade throughout coastal New England, and especially coastal Maine. So they came down from Nova Scotia, and they had been trading with the people like the Wowenoks and the other Abnaki communities in the coastal region here, probably for many decades, with the French fur trade, but it became so profitable, and the French supplied so many different items, and especially the guns, that pretty soon the Micmacs were really ready to go to war with the Abnaki communities like the Wowenoks. And in 1607, you have the attack of the Micmacs at Saco with the first use of firearms in the United States. And those firearms were supplied by the French. And the Abnaki communities did not have access to firearms, and they lost that battle, which is fairly well documented in terms of the literature. All this sort of stuff is in Nordica Reconsidered if you care to read about it. So we have 1607, that's a landmark date. Then we go through with quite a lot of activity with the French coming into Arcadia, and Castine being established and that sort of thing. And then the fur trading wars between the Native American communities sort of culminated in what's called the Battle of Hatchet Mountain, which is Hope. And in the Battle of Hatchet Mountain, you'll see a quotation in your handout that was where it discusses the fact that there was really quite a large community of Native Americans who were beaten by the Micmacs, and the Bathsheba, which was the head chieftain, was killed. And there was a series of Bathshebas. There may have been a series of 5 or 6 regional Bathshebas with one head Bathsheba. We're not really sure of the organization of Mewoshem and the Confederacy. At that point, there's not enough information to have any definite conclusions. But at the Battle of Hatchet Mountain, that was pretty much the end of the Confederacy of Mewoshem in terms of the defeat by the Micmacs. And mind you, the Micmacs, Passamaquoddies, and Maliseets were not part of the Confederacy of Mewoshem. They were the outsiders who were the fur traders and who wanted to control the fur trading down in this area. So, 1617 is the key date. And then just after the Battle of Hatchet Mountain, you had the Great Pandemic come through. So I don't know whether anybody's familiar with what happened to the populations of Native Americans, but down in Narragansett Bay, for some reason, Native Americans at Narragansett Bay and to the west of Narragansett Bay weren't particularly impacted by this great pandemic. But when you go east of Narragansett Bay, for example, in Plymouth, all of the Plymouth Native Americans were killed by the pandemic except one person who was maybe in England. And you had a loss of Massachusetts Indians was up 85, 95%. There was only a few inland communities like that later gathered the South Native. But you had a very high die-off rate. In Maine here, coastal Maine, I'm just guessing the die-off rate was between 80 and 90% for the rolling rock community. So you had this really highly populated area here, as shown by the shell heaps and the many archaeological sites that are in this area. And the die-off, that was a really devastating event for Native communities in Maine. And by the time you get to 1620, now you enter a whole new period with the English settlement of the coast of New England. So that's so I think the key interesting point from my personal point of view is the role of firearms that were traded for the furs is really quite an amazing story. And I don't think there's really been very much written on that, so it's a very interesting subject. But the shell heaps of Davistown, if you don't have it on the handout, this is one picture of what they look like in Mewoshem. And if you look at the person standing there, these are the largest shell heaps in the world outside of Oreo, and they attest to a very vibrant Native American community that was living in this area. And the loop in the river at Arambek is my personal opinion, and again, a lot of this is my personal opinion, and a lot of the academic historians wouldn't necessarily agree with me. Any academic historians here, please raise your hand. But anyway, now one interesting note is David Ingram. Anybody ever hear of David Ingram? He's in the literature, the history stuff, like, page 99 at some point. Well, he was involved in a mutiny down in Mexico, and he and one or two fellows probably took canoes up the Mississippi River, and they ended up hiking through Maine in 1569, and they got to St. John's, New Brunswick, and they caught a ride back to Europe with French fur traders and fishermen. So that's in 1569, not 16. 1569. And on the way, he has written, part of his story was he came across this really well-to-do Native American village that was loaded with gold and people well-dressed and all this sort of thing. So is that a myth, or did he go to Arambek? Now when Champlain came to Mount Desert Island, he sailed up to the Narrows and ended up on some rocks, supposedly at the sand beach part of the island, and stayed 2 weeks to repair a shell. So assuming that that did not happen in Hell's Cove, then he went up the Penobscot River looking for Norumbega, because Norumbega was supposed to be the stable city. And of course, when he got to the Babel, all he found was one tent. So based on his explorations, historians have decided that there was no such place as Norumbega. But in fact, when John Smith came to New England in 1614, he renamed Norumbega New England, because if you look on your early maps, Norumbega is a region. So it's like you're trying to find New England at the port of Bangor or something. It doesn't work that way. So Norumbega was a regional term, and I believe it's definitely a Native American term. And we go over the whole history of the various meanings of Norumbega in the Norumbega Reconsidered text. So very interesting story. So we are in Norumbega right now, and a lot of history here to be exploited and to be understood. And one of my points of view about this is that for communities here, bed and breakfast, restaurants, that sort of thing, you could have a network of historic sites that would be fascinating for visitors. The history of the region is one of the great resources, aside from lobster and clams. The history of the region is a major resource that has not really been fully exploited by local businesses and the community. If I had a bed and breakfast in Thomaston, I'd want to make a little map of the various historic sites, because there's many on the Georges River and Davistown, and a great place to live. I love living here, having Liberty Tools, so it's a lot of fun. So anyway, now we'll just take a look at the tools and technology timeline that I also handed out. So all of this stuff with Milwaukee is happening in the context of a technological series of events. You go back to your beginning of the use of blast furnaces in Europe, 1250 to 1350. By 1350, they were well established, where you would have hotter temperatures instead of having direct process bloomeries where you would melt the iron ore and make bar stock that would be refined. You had your blast furnaces operating at much higher temperatures, could produce much greater quantities of iron, but it was pig iron. It would have a lower melting temperature, and it would run out of the furnace in a liquid form, and then they would pour the liquid into pigs. That's why they call it pig iron. It would be cast iron. It would be very high in carbon, 3 to 4%, very brittle. Nothing you can make out of cast iron like that. So you have to take that big pigs of cast iron and you have to reheat it and refine it, and to make your malleable iron and make your wrought iron. So I think when I'm looking at the history of tools, you're really looking at the history of learning how to make pig iron into iron that would be useful to make tools. And your Saugus Iron Works, of course, when it was built 1643, that was one of the most important facilities, most modern in the world. It was in the top 5 of integrated ironworks, where you would blast out the pig iron and then you would refine it and make malleable iron and tools and all that sort of thing. So anyway, this is a good example of one of my favorite tools in the museum collection, a Plymouth, Mass hammer that's probably 1640 or something like that, probably made by a farmer in his backyard, and made directly from block iron with no fining, no refinement, no hammering, just a very primitive tool, and very interesting specimen for something that is indicative of what we began doing here when settlers came, and that was making tools. And of course the question is, when the Englishmen first came to Boston in the Great Migration, you had 10 to 20,000 people coming over. They brought almost all of their tools with them. and they were distinctly made of German steel and forged in a certain way and that sort of thing. And not too many of those survived. But then they began making tools in southern New England. Some of it was made directly out of log iron. There's some steel that was made out of forged log iron. And then there was a lot of German steel coming in that was made from the pig iron. And started making German steel from blast furnace products about 1350. And by the time you get into 1450, 1500, you begin to see a large production of that sort of steel in England also. So on the timeline, there's a little overview of the various events. So here's another key tool for the Native Americans, that the crooked knife, that the French would have supplied the steel for that, and that was an important tool in any toolkit. And that's a pretty early one right there. That's probably typical of what would have been available in 1600, 1650, for trading with the Native Americans. Okay, here's a really early primitive hand-forged corner chisel used for woodwork. It's probably related to the shipbuilding industry. And that's the most primitive one I've ever seen. And I would date that about 1650 plus or minus a few years. And that would be a southern New England manufactured tool. The same thing with this is a wrought iron chisel with all the little things in it. You know, it's not like cast steel. We have no imperfections. And the development of cast steel is about 1742, Benjamin Huntsman. So after 1750, the cast steel came in and changed the nature of many industries and was responsible for all those case furniture makers working in New Hampshire and Massachusetts making beautiful furniture. They had cast steel carving tools, which we still recover from time to time. You may see some at Liberty Tool every once in a while. So if you have any tools in your toolkit that says cast steel, that would indicate that it was made after 1750 and probably after 1780. And they marked the woodworking tools, even Witherby and Buck Brothers and the American makers would mark their tools cast steel that they used to make beautiful tools. And this is a little bit later from all this other things. But that's a later development. But that's what it sure might have looked like before you had any cast steel. And when I say natural steel, I'm thinking of steel that would be made direct process, the bloomery smelting it into the iron bars, and then the blacksmith working the natural steel direct process. Whereas if you look on your sheet again with the timeline at the bottom, you'll notice that the cast iron is high in carbon, and that's what you would reduce the carbon content to get your German steel. Whereas your natural steel would come out of your bloomery. So two different ways of making steel way back then. Now we have, of course, we live in the age of tempered alloy steel, so it's a different. Okay, there's another early socket chisel in here, and it has a mark on it. That's probably around 1700, but it's American made. And again, that's typical of the period. So these are tools that are coming in. Native Americans could use these, but most of the Native Americans died in the Great Pandemic. So there was only a few hundred rolling locks left by 1620, 1625. Okay, that has the name on it, CKO. The handle is later, so the handle doesn't match the date of the tool. Here's a primitive gutter axe that would be used by a shipwright to do some of the work on the shipyard. And a real early one, probably the earliest I've ever seen. Again, that's the kind of tool they would have made in New England between 1630 and 1700 before they had more sophisticated tool-making technologies come online. Okay, now here's the rafting furrow, very interesting because it's made out of recycled brass. And we see that a lot where you have ancient brass that may date back to the 12th century in Europe, and they would start making steel brass. For ones made in this country, they were often recycled because they were steel, and they had that in-between carbon content because you can't cut much with a wrought iron chisel. It's very dull. Doesn't work very well for cutting tool, and the cast iron doesn't cut anything. So in between is your various kinds of steel. Now here's a bark spout, again, hand forged, typical tool of the 17th and 18th centuries. Anybody ever use a bark spout to take the bark off the pitcher hemlock? They use them in Liberty for the tannery, where they use the bark from the hemlocks to make tannin and make something. And then a lot of people, of course, if you're building a wooden house, it's nice to get the bark off of the logs before you cut them up. So that was back in the old days, everybody had their bark spout. But that's a nice early one, they're hand forged. And then here's two of the earliest hinges I've ever laid eyes on. Again, they came out of southern New England, out of an old cellar in 18th century house. So those are all hand forged. That would be probably wrought iron. But those could be 1650. And if they didn't come out of Plymouth County, I would swear they could have been 14th century French or something, but I don't know. Maybe somebody brought them over when they wrote. But these things turn up. Now here's an ESP, very hard to date. Hand forged malleable line, a typical tool you would use in the fisheries. If you live in the coast, you need your eel spears. So a very essential part of the toolkits of the community that was coming in. And maybe they would trade a few eel spears to the Native Americans that survived the Great Pandemic. So there was certainly a lot of use of some of these tools by Native Americans who survived the Great Pandemic. Okay, there's another really natural steel tool. And just the way it's made, I don't believe it would be German steel. And a lot of times when you have a German steel, somebody would bring over a slab of German steel from France or England, and they would forge that on, and you would have what you call the weld steel tip on your tool. So this, that's a little bit later when you begin seeing the weld steel tip on your edge tools. After you had English blister steel coming into this country. The blister steel, first blister steel furnaces would be 1715, 1720 here in this country, a little bit later from the period that I'm talking about. But that's a new technology that came in that preceded the crucible steel. So you have a change in the technology. Almost all your tools made with blister steel or crucible steel are forge welded onto the tool. And you can often see them. Trying to learn it. I didn't bring any of those, just one cast steel, two of them. A grub hole again, hand forged, malleable iron, just a little bit more carbon in the malleable iron than in the wrought iron. If you had a wrought iron grub hole, it wouldn't hold up as well as the one with a little bit more carbon. It gives it a little bit more strength, it wouldn't bend as much on the tip. Next one. Okay, now here's a peat cutter. May have been used in the harvesting of the log iron. So that's an interesting tool. I don't see many of those. I think I've only had 3 or 4 in 45 years. So if you have any of those in your cellar, call me up, send me a picture. That's a fairly rare piece. And that would have been probably used for harvesting the log iron. And that, again, came from southern New England. And notice how it's hand forged, all handmade. No sign of any factory drop forging in a tool like that, which is 1840 now. Next. Blacksmith double calipers. These are hard to date, but they're typical of the kind of measuring tool that a blacksmith would be using anywhere from 1500 to 1800. And that's iron. It looks like it's bronze, but it's not. And that would be malleable iron, not quite as hard as steel and softer, and not quite as soft as the wrought iron. Okay, here's another malleable iron cast steel. On this tool, if you come up later to look at it, there's some hints of the welding of the steel onto the tip here. So here we have a sign tool. This is probably about 1700. Nicely forged in the handles and that sort of thing, but also signed by the maker, J. Briggs. And I'm just guessing for J. Briggs, that's probably mid-18th century, so it's a little bit later than what I called it. But a nice specimen to show you the hand forged. There's my trade axe. One thing we do not have, I unfortunately sold most of the trade axes at Liberty Tool that I've salvaged the last 40 years. They all traded in for money. But anyway, so I'm looking for a few more trade axes for the museum collection. And they're quite hard to date, the trade axes, because when I was first in the tool picking business, I was down in West Acton, Mass, at an antique shop. Somebody who brought things over from Europe. and I bought 30 trade axes, for a reasonable price. And they were all probably made in the last 100 years, where the technology for making these trade axes hasn't really changed in Europe. The same kind of furnaces and forges were used, no Bessemer there. Come out of German steel from the decauterized cast iron. I think when I say natural steel in that, that's a possibility. I'm not sure that's correct. But anyway, that's what the trade axe form would look like. And most of the trade axes would be Malvaline and German steel, come out of the Spanish region of Spain, just over the Pyrenees, and then they were traded to the French traders, and then it became French trade axes, even though they were made in northern Spain. So most of your trade axes, even though they may have come from French traders or traders, they were made even back then in the northern Spain, where you have a very vital and community of toolmakers, because you have the iron ores there that they would use. So no log iron in northern Spain, it was just rock ores. Yes. Okay, now we brought a newer tool. This is what the more modern 19th century tool would look like, and it's probably all cast steel. And cast steel can vary in quality, but they would save the best for the cutting edge right at the top. So here's our more modern looking tool. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. And this one's signed Hart. He's a 19th century maker. I'd have to look him up. Is that the last one in our sequence? Okay. Belt axe. I couldn't remember it. Well, this is a nice early piece. So, that may have been the kind of axe, if you're out in the woods and you're getting hungry and you want to kill a rabbit, you heave it and see if you could get it. And this would be a long time ago. So that's why they call it a belt axe. If you carry it with you and then it's time for lunch. So anyway, and not just an opinion. It may have had other purposes around the farm. But that's a very uncommon form. So interesting. Okay, so what else do I want to say? Okay, well, you see the timeline gives you kind of an overview of technological change during the 17th century. So anyway, again, I'd like to go back to the idea of the historic sites that are around here. Certainly the Georges River. Anybody here from the Georges River Land Trust? Remember the Georges River Land Trust? I was hoping that gather somebody that had been down to the Rembeck, to that Lupin River site and done some exploration. I've never actually explored the area. It's private property, but that is a very important site. And there's numerous other places around here that you could make up a little map that would, have all kinds of interesting shipyards and the spot where George Weymouth kidnapped the Native Americans was down the river here in maybe St. George's Harbor. Does that sound familiar? Anybody from St. George's Harbor? That's down here, about 10 miles down the river. So that's probably where they were kidnapped. But earlier they thought they were kidnapped more towards Pembroke, so I don't have too much of an opinion about it. But they were the Native Americans who told the story of Molossia. And here we are in Molossia now. So anyway, thanks for having me come. And we hope you visit the museum if you get a chance and enjoy our publications and all that. So,
Are there any questions for our speaker?
Which is the name of Hatchet Mountain? So has that been called Hatchet Mountain for a
Yep.
very, very, very long time?
Well, that's a good question. Certainly from the 19th century, Hatchet Mountain, yeah, there's a Hatchet Mountain Road in Hope,
Yeah.
in the center of Hope. And I've never actually been to Hatchet Mountain. I think there's some various opinions about exactly where the battle took place. But I think that was the key battle. It's written about, there's a quotation in the handout that we have on the left side of on the right side of the historic marker. So So you have a copy of what we did on the historic marker there with the different little maps. So I hope that's helpful in terms of my presentation here today. So if anybody has any additional information, go send me an email at the Davistown Museum. So,
There's another question back here.
Yeah, I just read recently that when the first settlers came here in Cushing, that there was an account that said that the Native Americans said it was okay if they settled as long as they didn't come up above the tide line.
right, see, that's very
So
true.
is that because this group was wiped out pretty much and they were the ones who were here? I mean, why would they?
Well, I
What
think
do you
this has
think
to
the
do with the
reason
French and Indian Wars. So we have the French and Indian Wars get going. And I think, for example, the Warming community would have been a key element in that, being unhappy with the English settlers. So, for example, Liberty is way above the high tide line. And in Liberty, just north of Liberty, there's a place called Kingdom Falls, which historically at the Kingdom Falls, the Penobscots, the Kennebecs, and the Wollanox would meet there to trade and to hunt. And then in the 1730s, during the French and Indian Wars, that became a place where a lot of the Iroquois and the remaining Native Americans, scattering from various tribes that survived, would come to fight the English. And I think that the attack at Owl's Head was one of the last fatal attacks by the Native Americans. I'm pretty sure they came out of Liberty from that launch, but that was the whole thing, was all during the, when the King Philip's War started, 1675, spread to Maine 1676, there was about 10,000 residents living east of York and Wells, and they all had to flee. So you had this really intense period of warfare after that. So before and after that, above the head of the tide, that was something I've seen quite a few times in the literature.
I'm just curious, you have Davistown, and then it's Liberty. What's the connection between Davistown and Liberty?
Okay, now Davistown Plantation, Plymouth Plantation, you have the plantations, 1807, Davistown Plantation became the town of Montville. Now, 1827, residents of Liberty had to fight with the residents of Montville, and then Liberty split off. So the plantation was the original settlers, and the first three residents, there was a hermit named Davis who lived up in the hills, 1760, 1770, 1775, 1780, the first settlers started to come down. The Davistown Road is one of the early roads out of Belfast for trading and stuff. And so interesting. And then then there was two Davis families that moved into Liberty, first families to move in, both were unrelated. So there was a lot of Davises in the early days of Liberty, so that's where Davistown Plantation comes from, because there were so many Davises as the initial settlers. Another question?
I believe the kidnapped victims, or some of them, were returned.
Yes.
But the whole incident couldn't have been good for international relations.
No, it's really, that was one reason why they were not too happy. The Warwick community was not too happy with the English that was coming, because only a few days after they sailed away, they realized it's a good thing they made it out before they were attacked. But I think one of the interesting things about the kidnapping is, in the literature, they quote something like 275 Native Americans coming out to greet Weymouth. Incredible number, of Native Americans for an area that's not supposed to, contemporary historians have hardly any population. And of course the shell heaps show you that there was a high population.
Are there any significant sites along the West Gate?
I don't know, but I think, if I remember correctly, I'm getting old and absent-minded, so I have to write everything down. I think the West Cape was one of the routes for communication and going over to Rembek and all that sort of thing. And of course, you have your Cross Island, you have your Moosabec Reach to Deer Isle, and coming across to where Bork did his excavations in Penobscot Bay, and then landing at north of Lincolnville Beach. And that trail, they found in Canada, Native American sites in Canada, copper from Wisconsin. And they find in Wisconsin artifacts from Nova Scotia. So you have this, and this is 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, you have Native Americans moving all through eastern North America. And if you were going from Nova Scotia to the Great Lakes, there's only one portage that you need to go from Maine to the St. Lawrence, and then the other portage that they used would have been the old county road that goes through South Liberty. That was the shortest route to go to between the Penobscot Bay and the Bangor for the Indian community back and forth. So that's an interesting part of the local history too, would be that route.
Very few people realize that there was a trading post at the foot of Wadsworth Street as early as 1630.
Okay, that would be
And
part of
then
it.
there was a fort built here in 1719, St.
Right.
George's Fort. And we were considered the edge of the eastern frontier. So there were many, many problems in this area.
Right.
And the settlers continually took
Any
refuge
idea
in
what
the
the
fort.
population of Thomaston might have been in 1650 or something before the King Philip's War started?
Before when?
Before 1675, in other words,
16
after
yeah.
everybody got...
It was there were 30 log cabins between here and Mill River where the sawmill was.
Yeah.
So,
But
and
there
a
was
few
certainly
scattered
active community.
houses.
And I think at 1675, most everybody had to leave, but there would be supposedly occasional people who stayed.
They stayed in the
Indian
fort.
Wars. So that's a whole other story.
Later.
And of course, 1719, that would be the first settlers coming back in.
In your studying, do you feel that Weymouth did come up with St. George instead of Belfast?
Well, I go by, let me see, what's the name of the fellow who wrote about that? It's in the bibliographies here. I think we cite him in the bibliography at the end. So Moore.
Yes.
So he's the one who has said, well, they came up with, so that's a matter of opinion. So who knows?
But you haven't found anything yourself that would indicate one?
I would only just go by what I read rather than artifacts that I found and left with the collarbone or somebody, So I would go with this later text by Moore who explores all this and has the opinion that. He also has the opinion that Samoset was one of the Native Americans kidnapped by George Weymouth, which I doubt that. But still, we're not sure. There's so many areas that are unknown that you can't say that George Washington, you can say when George Washington was born, but you can't pin down a lot of this other stuff. So.
When you, since the first European settlement really comes in that sort of within a generation that they die off, do you see any records or indications of the Europeans settling specifically on native sites because of cleared property?
Sure, the
things like
very
that?
essence of the Plymouth colony,
Yeah.
the Plymouth was, that was the very essence of that settlement. And I think there would probably be a lot of other examples of that. But Plymouth stands out as particularly notable because they had cleared so much land. And they would also tend to burn the land to hunt the deer in the winter. So there's quite a lot of nice places to build your settlements all through New England, many locations.
I know Eve's had her hand up a number of times.
I was wondering, in the beginning you talked about the fact that the Native Americans who had been kidnapped and brought to England, that they were thoroughly interviewed. And I was wondering how this happened. What language were they using? Were the Indians fluent in
Yeah,
English?
good question. I can't answer that, but I know that Fernando Borges, is that how you pronounce his name, was the governor of Maine in terms of being appointed, even though he stayed in England. And this is 1605 was the interview. 1622 was when he became governor of Maine. So he's this person that's interested in North American settlement all during this period and how exactly they communicated. I think they, I'm not sure exactly how they would write all this stuff down and communicate, but I think the Native Americans probably learned some English pretty quickly. Now, whether the English knew any Native American lingo, I have no opinion on that one. So.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Shall we thank our speaker?
thanks for having me here, and it's always great fun to bring these tools and show them and talk about this. So I just did a talk at the very sad story up at Pembroke Historical Society last week, and what an interesting place that is. The town is totally abandoned now, but there was a rolling mill in Pembroke that operated 1848 to the 1870s, and used pig iron to make malleable iron. And of course, it was Henry Court who perfected the rolling mills and the public furnaces, so you could make large quantities of malleable iron out of your blast furnace pig iron. So that was the key to the Industrial Revolution. So up here in Maine, where it's now virtually abandoned territory, that rolling mill went for about 30 years and was making as much as 20 tons of malleable iron a week to make hardware and hinges and nails. And of course, making nails was the biggest business in Napoleon.
Skip, we ran out of handouts. Would it be okay, would you mind if I made copies and
Sure.
distributed to some people? If one of the board members has a copy, I didn't get one? Oh, great, thank you. Thank you. If anybody
I'm just
needs
trying to
copies,
think,
just let us know. I'll make a copy for you.
Yeah, and for that, besides making a many copies of work,